Hello, thank you for coming here tonight to listen to us discuss perspective. It's actually been a really good opportunity for me to spend some time really looking in detail at Giacometti's work and thinking about it, because sometimes when you're doing an exhibition you get so wrapped up in the practicalities that you don't get so much time to actually think about the work in detail, so it's been a really good experience. And yes, as you can see from the title, I've given to my talk, Perspective. It's not so hard, not so easy to say. Perspective was very central to Giacometti's work. It was kind of preeminent importance, really. But the title isn't just wordplay. I've used it because it's also a description of what I'm going to be talking about, which is how Giacometti engage with the idea of multiple different definitions of the term perspective and the interconnection between them in his work. So I'm doing two things tonight, which I don't usually like to do. One, which is I'm going to be using notes mostly and kind of reading from a script, just because the subject matter can be quite complicated. And secondly, I'm going to start with a list of definitions, which I usually don't do, but I think it's quite useful here to just sort of define the different ideas of perspective that we'll be talking about. So firstly, perspective is, as you've just heard in detail, this kind of concept of a visual experience, so the appearance of objects in respect to their relative position from one another, and particularly from the viewer. It's also the art technique that you've been introduced to in detail, which is to replicate this viewed effect of multi-dimensional objects on a material surface, so normally 3D replicated on a 2D surface, to create the perception of form, depth, space and distance. Perspective is also a philosophical concept, so one's point of view or world view, how one sees or thinks, what affects one's attitude to life and way of doing things. And according to whichever philosophical tradition you follow, you might consider perspective to relate to some individualistic, objective notion of reality, or it could be considered a subjective view controlled by external factors, or some combination of the two. And perspective is also, in a way, a sense of some higher awareness. One is said to have perspective when you're said to possess a sense of proportion, a true understanding of the relationship between things, and particularly in terms of their relative value and importance. So, by Giacometti's own admission, Alberta Giacometti, so the oldest of three sons, he struggled with the artistic principle of perspective his whole life. His younger brother Bruno recounts that when they were boys, he'd become nervous when he sat for him as a model, because Alberto would be approaching him with his measuring compass and pointing it towards his eyes, because he was so intent on this idea of successfully reproducing the dimensions of Bruno's face on his artwork. And it was also as a teenager that Giacometti visited many ancient sites and ethnographic museums during his travels in Italy, and this is when he was really struck by the distance between real life and its representation, and that was a philosophical conundrum that he would never really resolve, but he would focus on throughout his life. When he went to art school in Paris, studying the studio of Antoine Bourdelle, he continued to work hard to reproduce the sense of anatomical proportion in his sculptures, drawings and paintings. But looking back on his life in a written biography, he spoke of his realization in his early 20s that the total impossibility of sculpting or painting what he sees. He felt unable to move forward at this point, really because he really felt like he was failing in his ability to use perspective in his work. And so at this point he was drawn into the avant-garde artistic debates about the extent to which representation should be a result of visual perception or whether it should be more as a result of mental image. And this briefly compelled him to abandon the hunt for realism by working from nature in favour of cubism and surrealism when he was working more from imagination and memory. During his engagement with surrealism, Giacometti struggles to define the role of the gaze was incorporated into the theme of his work. So we've got works here such as Gazing Heads or Point to the Eye, which is focusing on this idea of the gaze and the act of seeing. A point to the eye always reminds me of that story of Bruno as well, because it looks like this little figure is about to have this thing impaled into their eye. And this focus on the subject of the gaze was also evident in The Suspended Ball. This was a kind of key work in his surrealist career. It's the work that Salvador Dali saw, and that he got the sense that Giacometti was a surrealist from seeing this work, and invited him to show work with the other surrealists. And he described it as a prototype for his objects with a symbolic function. This work's also been described as possibly showing an eyeball on a razor's edge, so perhaps a precedent to the slicing scene in the Dali and Louis Buñuel's famous surrealistic film, short film, Un Chien Andalou, which you may know is this scene of this eye being sliced with the razor. And it's also kind of been thought to represent an anamorphic representation of vision. The work also suggests movement without representing it, which introduced the important element of metaphor within Giacometti's work, and obviously also has erotic elements, which is very visible part of his work during the Surrealist period. However, he couldn't stay away from this determination to represent the human figure in a form that corresponded to its perception in reality. And this was the itch that he felt compelled to scratch throughout his artistic life. So while Giacometti would invariably consider that his attempts ended in failure, his inability to achieve what he desired became the driving force for his creation. As the artist says in the Ernst Scheidegger film documentary, which we show excerpts from in the exhibition, there is only success proportionate to the failure. After less than a decade away from human representation, Giacometti returned to working from a life model on a daily basis, and for the rest of his life he continued to battle with this concept of perspective whilst representing the human form. However, his experience with surrealism in particular showed a great influence on his work ongoing when he dedicated his practice as an attempt to show what he saw rather than what he knows to be real. While other artists were experimenting with abstract forms and human representation was seen at the time as rather old-fashioned, it was Giacometti's experimentation with the concepts of perspective that made his art ever relevant and innovative, and that makes his ideas still important for us today as we think about how we see and the concept of the image. So this is one of the works of his friend Isabel that he produced soon after returning to using the formal rules of perspective and this representation of the human form. During the Second World War, having sought refuge in Switzerland, Giacometti worked out of a hotel room in Geneva, and it was at this time he created this series of tiny or miniature sculptures. He said that his decision to have the works diminishing in size appears to have been unconscious, as something that he surprised himself with, and it was almost against his will. He explained, "In spite of myself, I started big and ended up tiny. Only the tiny appeared to me to be true to life. I understood later. We see a person in her entirety only when she moves away and becomes tiny." So he was working from memory at this time, and he made this very small figurine on the left based on a memory of seeing Isabel, the model you see in the previous slide, in the distance on a Paris boulevard. As well as representing a representation of seeing someone from afar, it was for him the start of his attempt to sculpt this sense of the distance in a philosophical sense, so this distance between the viewer and the subject of their gaze. However, it was the position and the distance of the artist's eye from the model that became the aspect that conditioned the proportions of the sculpted or painted figure. So moving from a concern with naturalism and representing the object as one knows it to be, to rather a faithfulness to Giacometti's own perception, achieving this form of truth in his work, but one that was deeply subjective and only experienced by himself. And at some point later in life, he was questioned about his different treatment of men and women in his works. Women are often shown, or pretty much always shown, in this passive form. Often when it's a full figure, they're in this Egyptian style with their hands down by their sides and stood up straight or with their arms outstretched. And men were shown generally in a more active setting, so walking or pointing. And Giacometti answered that women seemed naturally more distant to him. So there was this sense of distance, and perspective was also a psychological perspective that was mirrored in the visual forms he created. As his works became smaller, the base, as you can see on the right-hand side, revealed itself to be a fundamental tool that he used to save his objects from disappearing. This is a portrait of his nephew Silvio. We have 3 representations of Silvio in these tiny figures that he shows at this size. And this huge double base beneath the very tiny figure was intended to make visible the proportion that would otherwise be ungraspable between the figure and the space surrounding it. So after returning to Paris after the war, Giacometti built on his learning from the tiny sculptures to take the concepts of perspective into a more philosophical realm. It was likely that his constant feeling of failure to represent the real inspired him to question the notion of perspective as a singular visual experience shared by all. This left open the door to challenging the rules of perspective and to distorting or even reinventing perspective through deliberate alterations. He began to be concerned not with representing someone as one knows them, but as one sees them. So it was less about realist representation of the features of the known object than as the representation of the visual perception of the viewer. While his figures became taller, the formal rules of perspective continued to slip away from him. The artist said, "I swore I was no longer going to let my statues become reduced even by 1 inch, but in spite of myself, my figures were becoming thinner. The reason is simple. The closer we are to a thing, the more we saw it foreshortened. In this case, it was the width that I saw foreshortened." So building on his realization from the very small figurine and the standing women that he produced after the Second World War, Giacometti later explained, "It is impossible to grasp the totality of a figure. We were much too close to the model, and if we started from a detail, a heel or a nose, there was no hope of ever reaching the whole. So in works such as the leg, he therefore reduced the essence of the person to a single aspect of their physical presence, explaining his reason for making his works thus: it was not possible for me to make a big figure with various well-determined parts of the whole, well-determined parts at the time. However, I had the desire to define an arm, a leg, a belly. All I was left with was the possibility of making a part for the whole. I cannot simultaneously see the eyes, the hands, the feet of a person who is standing 2 or 3 meters in front of me, but the sole part I'm looking at carries with it the sensation of the existence of the whole." He made the decision to place this work on a pedestal, accentuating the strangeness and distortion of the leg and encouraging the viewer to question their own sense of perception when they're looking, or sense of perspective when they're looking at the work. I also think this is probably a play on the rules of perspective that you see in ancient art, when the figures, statues and temples were often seen at a great height, and so the features, the arms and legs were often elongated to overcome the sense of visual foreshortening when you looked upwards. This concern with not being able to simultaneously see the whole of a person, a growing focus on the visual experience of personal perception, was something that became a central drive in Giacometti's work. With his interest in adhering to the conventional rules of perspective becoming ever more distant, Giacometti was increasingly fascinated with investigating the distance he had long recognized between reality as seen and its representation. He found nothing was like I imagined it to be. A head became an object completely unknown and without dimensions. It was actually seeing a film in 1945 that provoked him to recognize a significant change in his practice. He announced after seeing that he'd had this complete transformation of reality by understanding that reality was poles apart from the supposed objectivity of a photograph or a filmed image. So this philosophical rethinking of the extent of reality was related to the philosophical debates of the day. Giacometti was friends with existentialist philosophers Simone de Beauvoir, who you see here on the right-hand side, and Jean-Paul Sartre, as well as playwrights Samuel Beckett. His approach to representation appears to be indebted to the existentialist concept that perspective isn't fixed, that humans attempt to create their own rational views and meaning in life while operating in an irrational setting, a situation that is said to lead to the absurd as well as feelings of alienation. And Sartre himself saw the links between his thinking and Giacometti's figures, describing them as always mediating between nothingness and being. So Giacometti began to appropriate the formal techniques of perspective into his work, and they became like aesthetic elements or signifiers within his work. Unable to overcome what he saw as the gap between what he saw and what he created, this struggle to create became his aesthetic force. It is a concept similar to this idea in the tiny sculptures when you see him taking this formal device of the base, so a formal device that's related to the rules of artistic perspective, and he incorporates it as a creative element within his work, and it takes on a symbolic meaning, and this is much like this cage within his work. At his Paris art school, he'd been taught the technique of reducing the figure into geometric volumes using a grid structure encased within a cage. And this was a process with links back to ancient Egypt and non-Western traditions that appealed to Giacometti's enthusiasm for ethnography, and which he declared to be more real than naturalism or even photography. The theme of the cage will be evident throughout his practice in sculpture, in his paintings and drawings as well. And instead of trying to hide the process of perspective, Giacometti highlighted it, and it even inspired this theme of the cage within his work. He noted that according to one's structure and position, each of us sees certain facets, certain parts of facets. The cage therefore compels the viewer to turn around the work, changing their own perspective, as well as destabilizing their power dynamic between the object and the viewer. Tradition, you think of the object as something to be seen by the viewer, and the viewer has this kind of dominant position, but by forcing the viewer to circulate around the work, the actual object takes on the power in that relationship. And so, anticipating this, Giacometti created a series of points of view whilst the viewer circles the work. That you can see clearly in the cage. Recognizing the increased dependence on the mobility of the gaze and seeking to mobilize a multi-perspective sensation within the viewer, he, in works such as Tall, Thin Head, attempts to represent multiple perspectives in a single work, and these therefore require the viewer to move around the sculpture, again to change their own view in order to fully appreciate the work. In Tall, Thin Head, the device of the cage is absorbed into the work, likewise creating this kind of idea of a window onto different sides of the work, and each side offers a different point of view. But rather than a succession of static viewpoints, each of the views morph into one another. According to this, the essence of the object only becomes possible to conceive by looking from all perspectives, which refutes the idea that a sense of reality can be grasped just from looking from a single point of view. And this artistic concept also has implications for other parts of life, such as in social relationships, in terms of having to conceive the multiple viewpoints to fully understand the situation. It was Giacometti's recognition of his own constant changing perspective that led him to endlessly repeat and rework the same figures as he attempted to better understand his own vision. So he was very obsessive in terms of returning to works and themes again and again, more so than most other artists, but that was all linked to this idea of changing perspective. And for this reason, my co-curator, Catherine Grenier, explains in the catalogue that for Giacometti, the categories of abstraction and figuration are unsuitable to explain his compositions, whose forms can be deciphered differently according to the physical or mental point of view adopted. So the morphing of viewpoints was also related to the concept of metamorphosis, which was important to Giacometti and his peers. This was inspired actually especially by Franz Kafka's book Metamorphoses. It was first published in French translation in 1928, just as Giacometti was at art school and having this flirtation with Cubism and Surrealism. And so ever since this point, Giacometti's incorporated this idea of this symbolic perspective into his work, and a focus on the idea of change from one thing to another. His interest in anthropomorphism is shown most clearly in the figures in space section we've got in the exhibition, as people transform into objects such as trees and stones set in a landscape, which Giacometti accentuated with titles for his group figure works such as The Forest and The Glade. And the most famous and enigmatic of these group works is his Women of Venice, shown at the French Pavilion at the Venice Biennale in 1956. According to the British art critic and curator David Sylvester, who is a strong advocate of Giacometti's work, as I stand looking at one of the standing women, she will be as distant as a person at the other side of the road, then suddenly appear to be looming up over me. The women of Venice, with their curious proportions and intense expressions, give the impression of constant change. Through these engagements with perspective, Giacometti himself going back to my list of definitions, it was through these engagements that Giacometti himself gained perspective, or had perspective, by creating a higher awareness of its various concepts and his involvement in them as an artist. As Catherine Grenier again noted, in Giacometti's oeuvre, gaze and thought united together are projected to the limits of representation until they verge on disappearing. But according to Giacometti himself, I do not work to create beautiful paintings or sculpture. Art is only a means of seeing. No matter what I look at, it all surprises me and eludes me, and I am not too sure of what I see. Thank you.